be great. Hi folks, I can see that we've got people coming in quite quickly, so we'll just give a minute or two because I think we've got about a quarter of the people coming who have signed up, so we'll just give it another minute and then we'll get started. If attendees want to use the chat to say hello and where they are joining from, then feel free to do so. It's always nice to know where people are. And we'll yeah, have a look at that in a second. Angela, I can see you've put your hand up, but I'm hoping you're just waving. If there's something you need help with, if you use the chat, then I can help with that. I've just noticed that Gillian Butler is here. She said, "Hi folks, just to let you know I'm here if not visible." So it's nice to know that Gillian is in the webinar, even though she's not presenting. So we will make a start just to let everybody know that this is being recorded and will be available afterwards. We'll send the link round and make it available to everyone who had registered. So good evening and welcome everybody to this webinar, and we're really fortunate and excited to be joined by three of the researchers who were working on the SusCatt project. So this was a project which was looking at increasing productivity, resource efficiency and product quality, increasing economic competitiveness of forage and grazing based cattle production systems. So it's very much in line with the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association ethos and focus around pastured livestock systems. So we are joined by Hannah Davis, Havard Steinshamn and Carsten Malisch, who will each be presenting this evening. We are happy to take questions, so each of them will be presenting, and I'd like to ask attendees to use the Q&A box, which you should see at the bottom of your screens, to ask any questions. We will be picking up some of those after each presentation, and then we will have a bit more time for Q&A at the end of the session. So I'm going to hand over first to Havard, who's going to start us off. If you want to share your screen, and yeah, look forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Thank you very much, Nikki. I'm very glad that I got this opportunity to talk to you. Can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yeah.
That's good. Yes, I'm Havard Steinshamn. I'm a researcher in Norway, and please, you must be aware that this is a Norwegian context, a bit different from what you are used to, I guess. Who of you are participating? Most of you are from Britain, I suppose. The title is Profitability from Forage-based dairy systems. So I will also come into some environmental indicators as well. As Nikki said, this is a part of the SusCatt project, and my presentation is on the work we did in Norway. So first, a little bit about the background. Productivity of milk and milk production has increased tremendously, I must say. Also in Norway, these are the annual milk yield per cow, the change over time here in Norway, expressed as kilogram and energy corrected milk per cow in a year. And this is mainly driven by increased pelagic nutrition, that is more concentrate and less grazing. This graph shows the net energy intake per dairy cow annually on average across whole Norway, or the dairy cows that are part of this national herd recording systems, which I think is more than 90% of all dairy cows are included. And as you see that the concentrate intake per cow and year has increased quite strongly, while the grazing intake of pasture has decreased. Also, of course, the silage intake has also increased at the same time, but mostly we can explain the increase in milk yield here in Norway, at least, by the increase in the use of concentrate. And this is perhaps very Norwegian context, because this is a bit different. Here is a graph showing the milk price and the price of concentrate over time. The blue line here is the milk price expressed as Norwegian kroner per liter. You can divide by 10, then you have about the price in pound. And you see that the milk price in Norway, the farmers have got increasing milk price for the product over time, while the concentrate has changed a bit, but not at the same say rate as the milk price has increased, so that the milk concentrate rate has also increased. So this explains partly the increase in the use of concentrate at the payback. And the sustainability of this intensification is questioned. And I have to say a little bit about Norway as the Norwegian context. Norway is far north of UK. The southern part of Norway is on the same latitude as you find in northern parts of Scotland. There are some, and I think that some of these conditions here in the southwestern Norway is similar to what you find in the area around Aberdeen, maybe. Here we have a very short growing season, as shown by this graph. Here in the southwestern part of Norway, we have about 7.5 month growing season, while up in the far north, we have about 4.5 months. So there's a huge variation in climate condition due to this latitude gradient, but also due to the altitude gradient from the coast up to the mountain areas. So that also explains some of the variation that we have here in Norway. And agriculture is, we have only about 3% of the total land area is agriculture. In this map, the yellow color here is affected the agricultural area. So it's very much concentrated around the Oslo region, southeastern Norway, and some on the southwestern part, and also around this Trondheim region. Most of the agricultural area is. And the employment in agriculture is, I think the last is 2016 figures I have is less than 2% of the total employment is in agriculture. And the agricultural percentage of total gross domestic production is only 0.5%. And animal products account for about 70% of the total income in the agriculture sector. And milk alone is about 30%, and ruminant meat production about 16%. That means that in the agricultural sector of Norway, the ruminant production accounts about around 45% of the total income in the agriculture. And a large part of the plant products, which is the grain, is also used as feed to the animal sector. So the objective of my presentation today is how is concentrate level per cow affecting economic performance and indicator of environmental impacts. And we also wanted to see is there's a relationship between the economic performance and the indicator for environmental impact. And how are farm characteristics and management practices influencing the variation in indicators for profit and environmental factors? And are there farm characteristics and management factors that may give synergies between profit and environmental factors? That was our objective of our work here in Norway. And our data source is 200 dairy farms in central Norway. Central Norway is the counties in the central of Norway. It's 3 counties, and the 200 farms, they are about 10% of all the farms in this area. And we had data from 3 official years, from 2014 to 16. Out of this 215 were organic. 78 had robot milking, 84 pipeline, and 38 with the milking parlor, and 84 with the pipeline had by tie stalls, and 116 are loose housing. 40 is in joint farming and 160 not. Joint farming, that means that the farmers, they have merged their herds together and run this as one enterprise. And then we have data from the so-called TNA, is the dairy company in Norway, where most of the dairy farmers deliver their milk, and about 90% of the farms are part of this. And in this data from this so-called mjölkonomi, we have the farm accounts, but they also have feed and production data, and also data on animal health and fertility, which we got access to. Here, I don't want to go to detail in this table, but just to illustrate that in this data, we had quite substantial variation in farmland. Farm were on average 46 hectares, but varies from the least one was 12 and 185 hectares was the biggest one. Also huge variation in milk quota. We have quota systems still here in Norway, and the average herd was 37 cows, and also quite huge variation in stocking rate, in the milk yield per cow from 5,300 up to more than 10,000 on average per farm. And also the use of constant pasture, which is not, I think you are very impressed about, but it's well on average, but about somewhere has as high as 25% of the total intake of the net energy for the cows were on pasture. So there are some that are doing grazing also here in Norway still. And the grass on the yield was also quite huge variation, and the culling rate, there was also variation. And there also a quite huge variation in the treatment for mastitis, and also the fertility rate is also a quite huge variation. So there are, in this data set, we have quite huge variation between farms, as indicated by this so-called coefficient of variation. The annual milk yield is the one factor of what I'm showing here, the variable that doesn't show it, but it's from 5,000 up to 10,000 in average per cow and herd. And the indicators that I looked at is the gross margin, which is the revenues minus the variable costs per kilogram energy corrected milk. And I call it energy corrected milk equivalent because we have included also the sale of meat from these farms. And we have converted this into so-called energy corrected milk, which is about 0.42 kilogram meat per, is equivalent to 1 kilogram of energy corrected milk. And then we have this global warming potential, 100 years as a kilogram CO2 per equivalent per kilogram energy corrected milk. And we have the energy intensity, which is the use of energy, fuel, electricity, fertilizer, concentrate per energy corrected milk. And we have the nitrogen intensity, which is the amount of nitrogen in purchased fertilizer, feed, deposits, fixation, per kilogram nitrogen in milk and meat delivered. And we have an indicator which we call area used to produce crops in purchased concentrate as a proportion of the total area used. Then we have calculated how much area the farm is using outside the farm. That is basically the area used to produce the concentrate that I purchase, which is basically produced in Norway, but also some also from outside the country. And then we have the indicator land occupation is the total area used in square meter per kilogram energy corrected milk. That is included both the land around themselves and the land that is used to produce the grain used in the concentrate. Okay. And then we have I show here the variation in these indicators. Here is the gross margins that shows also quite a variation between farms. Also the global warming potential, the energy intensity, nitrogen intensity, or the use of area outside the farm is also quite huge variation between farms, and also the total land occupation in square meter per energy corrected milk. And then we grouped the farms in 3 equal size groups. The 200 groups were 200 farms divided in 3 groups according to the amount of concentrate they were using per cow and year. 67 farms and 68 in the high. I call them low, medium, and high, which is according to concentrate levels. And from the lowest to the highest, they were on average 1,000 kilogram dry matter they use for concentrate per cow and year difference. And then also the forage proportion differed from 63% about for the low up to down to 52% for the high feeding farms. And also the pasture proportion in the diet differed. The number of cows differed also. So those feeding highest amount were on average higher, had higher, bigger herds. And the farm area didn't differ, and the stocking density also differed. Those with low concentrate levels per cow had lower stocking density than those on fed highest amount of concentrate. And the milk quota also differed according to the levels of concentrate, while the quota fill didn't differ. So they managed to fill the quota similarly, those 3 groups of farms. So we come to the results here, and here we see on the left side here is a low, medium, and high concentrate level on the farms group, the grouping, and then we have here on the left side the blue and I'm colorblind, so I can't say that. Sorry, but on the left side here, these bars are the milk price and the payment from the government subsidies. And you see that the low farm had got more for the milk than the medium and high level concentrate group of farms. And also they had lower costs. So on average, they had higher, better gross margin, the low compared to the high. And also, if you calculate this called the contribution margin, where you take the revenues minus the operation costs and the production dependent fixed costs, and also also if you take away also the production independent fixed costs, you see that the farms on the low had higher revenues than or margins that better margins that the farms feeding more concentrate. So to conclude, the farms that had the lowest concentrate had a lower performed financially better on average. That said, it's important to say that the cost for labor is not included here. It's only the cost that is for the inputs and also the interest and so on, but the labor cost is not included here. And if you go to go to these indicators of milk yields, the milk yield were also affected, of course, by the concentrate levels. So on average, the low had about 7,900 kilograms, while the high had about 1,000 kilograms more milk per year. The milk produced per total cattle, for the total herd didn't differ between the farms. But you didn't find any difference in the global warming potential between the farms with the 3 groups. No difference in energy intensity, no difference in nitrogen intensity. The low farms, those feeding less concentrate, use less area outside the farm compared to those who had the highest input of concentrate. So that means that they used less area, the low farm, outside their farm for milk production than those on high. But the land use, the total land use, were higher on the low farm compared to those on high. Okay. Nicky, you have to stop me if I go beyond my time. Okay, so then we also wanted to, as I said initially, that we want to see the relationship between economic performance and indicator for environmental impact. and if some of the farm characteristics and management practices influence this variation I present now. And also are the farm characteristics and management factors that may give synergy between profit and environment factors. So what we did, then we ran some correlation. Then we lumped the data from all farms together. And what we found is that there was a positive correlation between the gross margin, the global warming potential, the energy intensity, nitrogen intensity, and land occupation. That means those farmers that has the highest gross margin, they also had most negative effect on the so-called environmental indicators. And except that those who there was a negative correlation between the gross margin and the area for purchased feed, and also there's a negative correlation with area use in purchased feed and the energy and nitrogen intensity, and which is also understandable. And a positive correlation here between the environmental indicators, the land use, and energy intensity and nitrogen intensity. Of course, those farms that rely on input of energy and nitrogen also had use more land in total. So that means this data indicated it's difficult. There is an off trade between net margin, also the gross margin, and environmental indicators. So this is not what is usually presented when you look at other data or other publication. So what we did then, we used a so-called multiple regression to try to reveal farm characteristics and management practices that influences the variation of the indicators across the individual farms. I don't go into details, but there's a lot of farm characteristics that we have, and management, and also animal health and fertility indicators. So I want to stress that this is association and not causality. So just so I say that, so that it's not something that if this relationship we find, that this is kind of mechanistic function or causality, which is not. And here is this figure here, so-called R-squared, indicate how good the models explain the variation. And some of the gross margins is quite high, and also the land occupation and area outside the farm, used outside the farm, is quite good. And you see that the farms that are in joint venture, those farms that have merged the herds and run the farms together, they have performed economically better. And those who have rotting milking, they have performed less good than the others on when it comes to gross margin, and also they use more area outside the farm. And those that are tie stalls, they have also less, are associated with less global warming potential. And you go further on, those farms that the higher the herd, the bigger the herds are, the less they have on the gross margin. And I also see that increasing those farms that are high proportional costs of the total herd, they perform quite good on the environmental indication, like for instance the global warming potential, energy intensity, and nitrogen intensity, and also land occupation, but they have performed less good on when it comes to economically a financial outcome. And also the similar is for the stocking rate. Those who have high stocking rate also perform quite good on some of the environment indicators, except for use of land outside the area. And those who have managed to fill the quota, the milk quota, they also perform better on some of the environmental indicators. And then we go to concentrate per cows, and you see that there is no association in this data set between the level of concentrate and on environmental indicators, except they also perform economically worse than the other farms. Or there's a negative relationship between use of concentrate and economical performance. And also when it comes to the use of concentrate, the total herd is also associated with some of the use of negatively by that they are using more area outside the farm and they occupy more land for producing milk and meat. While milk yield has some, which is maybe obvious, that the high milk yield is that they perform better on some of the environmental indicators, and was not associated with the gross margin, but of course, or not of course, but it's easy to understand they also use more land outside the farm by purchasing more concentrates. While meat, the meat production, the quantity of meat produced in the total herd had a positive effect of gross margin, and also some of the environmental indicators. And go to nitrogen fertilization, that was associated with negative effect on the gross margin, and also of some of the increase some of the environmental indicators, and reduce the land occupation. Those which also may be easy to understand. And only the variable that only had positive effect with respect to gross margin and environmental indicators were herbage yield. Those farms that were able to have high, there was a positive association between herbage yield and the gross margin, and also they had less negative impact on some of the environmental indicators. Also, those farmers that had high, or farms that have high pasture level in their diet, they also performed better economically and also had less environmental impact when it comes to global warming potential and nitrogen intensity. And some of the herd health or fertility indicators also had some effect, like for instance, culling rate, which was negatively associated with gross margin, and also the number of insemination they had to use for get the cows take calf. They also had some increase the global warming potential, energy intensity on land occupation. While those who had a high non-return rate after 50-60 days of the artificial insemination, they performed better economically and also had less impact on nitrogen intensity. So I come to the end. What we found here, that there was a trade-off between the economic and environmental sustainability measures in this data on these farms in the central Norway. But we found that higher forage yield and more pasture in the diet may improve the profitability and reduce the global warming potential per energy corrected milk and meat produced, reduce the nitrogen costs, reduce the land occupation, and reduce the reliance on area outside the farm for production of purchased feed, which means grain used in the concentrates. Yes, thank you for your attention. As Rikke said, this is a part of this SusCatt project that was funded by the ERNET Susan, and so the national research councils around the European countries that was part of this project. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Havard. That was absolutely brilliant. If you want to just end your screen share, there's a couple of questions that we'll go to. So a lot of interest, I think, in what dairy farming in Norway looks like. One question was around the genetics. So you talked about milk yield increasing. Has the dairy cow genetics changed during that time? Has there been an increased Holstein influence?
Yeah, it's a good question, and a good question I can't answer. No, it's basically it is Norwegian red. Most are Norwegian red, and the Norwegian red, this breeding association, they claim that there has been a genetic improvement also when it comes to milk yield. but there are some farms that are introducing Holstein, but I'm quite sure, confident that that is not the case. I'm quite sure, and I think it's a general agreement among those who are that works with in this sector with dairy farming, that also with the TNA association, that is this dairy association, they also says that the increase we have seen the last 20 years is due to the increase of the plain nutrition. It's not genetics.
Okay, thank you. And just a couple of other questions before we move on. There is some interest in, you talked about the data set not including the labour costs, but someone is interested in the difference between the difference in how much labour high and low concentrate using farms need. So did you collect that data?
No, we don't have the labour costs because no, we don't have them, and the reason we were using the already existing data that was from this dairy association, and they don't collect the labour costs. And I'm not sure if that explains. I think that if someone argue against me, they'll say that okay, those who do grazing, they perform economically better than those who doesn't. Also, there is a positive association between the gross margin and the use of grazing as a proportion. And they will say that okay, that's fine, but they also spend more time on their herds. So they have probably higher labor costs.
Okay, thank you. And then one last question before we move on, and then we will come back to some of the other questions. So don't worry, folks, if you've asked a question and it hasn't been answered, we'll try and come back to it. There's a question about the merging of businesses and the operating together in joint farms. Was it a government initiative or is it something that is led by the farmers?
It is. That's also a good question. It was open because Norwegian dairy farms, they are very much subsidized, not only the milk price, but also for running the farms. And when they opened up 20 years ago, that so that those farms that went together as a joint farm, they didn't lose their governmental subsidies, because that was restricted before. So that opened up so that it was okay. You don't lose your government payment if you go into a merged farms. And I didn't say that, but that has also caused an increase in milk production, because when they merged their herds, maybe 3-5 farms go together, they build a new barn so that they could keep the cows together. And then the cost of building new barns is so high that in order to reduce the building costs, they increase the milk yield. So that is also drove the what you have seen now, the milk increase in milk yield.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We've got some other really interesting questions, but we'll come back to those at the end. So I think we're going to hand over now to Carsten, who's going to present on a separate part of the project. So if you want to start sharing your screen.
Will do. All right. And here we go. Can you see the presentation mode now?
Yep, perfect.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. So yes, I'm my part of the presentation today is about the greenhouse gas emissions and the milk yields of forage-based dairy systems. And I'm going to talk about the results from our experimental research farm here in Kiel. So I want to start by just mentioning that many of the issues of production systems in general, and this includes both arable as well as dairy, have resulted from the intensification and specialization of both of these production systems. And particularly in dairy, this specialization has resulted in a high reliance on edible food. So we have an increased food feed competition. We rely more on imported feed and inorganic fertilizers with the known environmental consequences that brings. And because of this increased food feed competition and more concentrates, basically, of course, grass is becoming less and less in those diets. which results in biodiversity losses, land degradation, water contamination, etc., and also losses of soil organic carbon. And it was often argued, and at least we hear that a lot, that, well, yes, there are these environmental benefits, but at the same time, if you have an intensive confinement system, then emissions are generally much lower, because in intensive barns you are much better able to tweak everything and you can control everything much better. And as a result, from this high forage quality from the concentrates and you being able to control everything, you have much lower emissions. So this is something you hear a lot. And in our group, we actually did a meta-analysis where we compared all the published results basically from different systems, and we categorized them as confinement, either confinement, which just meant that in these studies the cows didn't have any access to pasture, or we classified them as mixed systems, which meant that they had up to 50% of their feed derived from pasture, or pasture systems, which basically just meant more than 50% of the feed of these animals was coming from pasture. And then on the y-axis, you can see the carbon footprint in kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And what you can immediately see is across all three of these systems, there is a huge variability, with very efficient farms performing excellent, and then there are farms which perform much worse and have much higher carbon footprints. And you can basically see that much less than the fact whether you have a confinement, a mixture, or pasture system, it depends on how efficient your farm is being run. So it is much more important how well you do rather than what you do. But at the same time, you can see that pastoral systems, the best pastoral systems, even slightly outcompete confinement systems, meaning that this truth that people believed before, that confinement systems are generally much more efficient and thus also produce lower carbon footprints, isn't really true if you look at the data. And this life cycle analysis doesn't even account for carbon sequestration. So carbon sequestration from grasslands isn't accounted for. And if you would take those into account, then of course these systems with high pasture shares would perform even better, because then you would have even lower carbon footprints. So this basically resulted in us being quite confident that we can define pastoral systems even more. And we basically tried to optimize within the framework of integrated crop livestock systems. So of course, a mixed farming system with both arable and livestock, and using crop rotations, where basically the waste product from arable is becoming a resource from livestock and vice versa. So within this framework, we then tried to see how we can improve these mixed farming systems even further. And our focus, of course, is on the grassland lays. And here, of course, we're using grass legume mixtures, but we're trying to make them even better by using bioactive forages. And I will mention on the next slide a bit in more detail what that means. But the final goal that we have is to have an eco-efficient pasture-based dairy production. Now, there is a whole lot of research, and of course we are free to discuss a lot of that in the discussion later on if you want to, but for now you just have to take my word that there has been lots of studies showing that legume-based diverse mixtures are really excellent and superior compared to monocultures because of a higher niche complementarity and facilitation effects. That means, for example, that the N fixation from legumes is then also providing nutrients for the non-legumes, etc. So this is the facilitation, but also the niche complementarity, meaning that deep rooting species have access to resources that shallow rooting species don't have access to, etc. And for example, in case this is water, then you have a higher general drought resistance and a higher yield stability, because some of these species are always performing well independent of the environmental conditions. So we always knew that legume-based diverse mixtures are generally outperforming grass monocultures. But as I said, we wanted to make that even better by including plant-specialized metabolites. And I also don't want to go too much into detail on those because it would get very technical and maybe also boring. But I just want to mention that proanthocyanidins, which are condensed tannins, are an important part here. And maybe several of you might have still learned that that tannins in general are anti-nutritive factors and that you don't want them in your diet. And while this is still true for monogastrics, for ruminants, one has sort of outgrown this idea, and tannins are now considered to be actually a valuable tool because they can improve the protein use efficiency. They have been shown to decrease the enteric methane production, so improve the environmental performance there. And they increase animal health by preventing frothy bloat and by having anthelmintic properties, meaning that they reduce the burden of nematodes in the ruminant. So with this approach of taking already known knowledge on the diverse pastures and making them even better by including tannin-containing species, we try to identify how we can make dairy production even more sustainable and also maintain productivity. So let me briefly introduce the Lindhof, which is our experimental research farm on which we did all of these experiments and still do. The Lindhof has a total area of around about 160 hectares, of which only 7 hectares are permanent grassland. So the largest share, 110 hectares, are in an arable crop rotation, basically, with always 2.5 years of a grassland lay and then followed by different other crops. We have around about 100 dairy Jersey cows on that Lindhof, which graze continuously from March to November. And we have a seasonal spring block calving system where calving is restricted to February, from February to mid-April. And the pastures are used in rotational grazing with 9 to 11 grazing cycles. So each pasture is grazed up to 11 times per year. And the whole research farm is organically certified, and it is self-sufficient in concentrates. And this is actually something that we always try to aim. Our research is trying to figure out how low we can go with concentrates without reducing productivity. And at any time, we are growing 3 different mixtures on the Lindhof. So all of these mixtures are constantly rotating as grassland lays in the crop rotation. And the most simple mixture is a binary mixture where we have perennial ryegrass and white clover, so a legume and a grass, but both shallow rooting species. Then we have a ternary mixture, which is slightly more complex by including red clover as well. So we have another legume, but this time a deep rooting one. And then finally, we have a complex or diverse mixture consisting of 8 species, which includes the 3 that we've mentioned before, but then also some herbs and more legumes. So we have chicory, caraway, salad burnet, birds for trefoil, and ribwort plantain. And the interesting species from a tannin point of view here, so the bioactive herbs are salad burnet and birds for trefoil, which contain tannins. Yes, exactly. So those were the ones that we thought would reduce the methane emissions. And with this setup, with these 3 different mixtures, we would then try to see how the increased pasture diversity would reduce environmental impact, such as methane emissions, nitrate leaching, and nitrous oxide emissions, and how at the same time milk yield would be affected from that. So I'm going to briefly introduce the main experimental research design to you, where we measured milk yield and methane emissions particularly. This was done in 2 different periods. The first period was in around 50 days of lactation in May 2019. And then there was the bull in the herd, and we couldn't do measurement for quite a while. And then around 150 days in milk, so quite a lot later in the lactation period, we had a second measurement period. In both of these measurements, we compared only the binary and the diverse mixture. So the ternary mixture was excluded from this experiment because from the workload, we couldn't manage more than 2 mixtures. And each of these mixtures was supplemented with 2 kilograms of concentrate per cow and day. 26 cows were used that were grouped in 2 different groups of 13 cows, which were assigned based on their pre-experimental milk yield, days in milk, live weight, and parity, so that we have homogeneous groups. And then we measured in a so-called crossover design. What that means is that what you can see here, each measurement campaign or period lasted 2 weeks. And in the first week, group 1 was grazing the binary mixture and group 2 was grazing the diverse mixture. And then after 1 week, they swapped and group 2 now grazed the binary mixture, and group 1 the diverse mixture. And the reason for that is that that way we can reduce the animal effect, and each cow has grazed every mixture, so that we can really see the difference based on the mixture and not on the of the cows in the group. And then, of course, we measured the herbage mass yield, and of course, the paddocks were assigned so that the pre-grazing biomass, so the forage on offer, was the same for both groups. And we measured pre- and post-grazing biomass, the botanical composition, the forage quality was measured daily via NIRS. And in the animals, we measured the milk yield and the milk quality and the methane emissions via the SF6 tracer technique. And if you want to know more in detail what the SF6 tracer technique is, we can discuss that later on as well. But for now, it is a method with which we can determine methane emissions on the pasture from grazing cows. So let's start with forage quality. Here you can see the two mixtures, binary and diverse, for the first period, so in May, and the second period in August. And as you can see, the dry matter digestibility or the organic matter digestibility was very high, with up to 88%, and the lowest was 78%. And generally, the binary mixture always had a slightly higher digestibility by around about 2%, but generally it was very high throughout the periods, with the first period in spring having slightly higher digestibility. The energy concentration of the forage in megajoule metabolizable energy was also very high, and it was more than 12 in the first period and still more than 11 in the second period. And crude protein was slightly limited, particularly in the binary mixture in the first period, because in the binary mixture, the grass was much more dominant than in the diverse mixture, and hence crude protein was only at 11.5%. Whereas then in the second period, when the grass had become weaker and the clovers took up more space, it was 18.5 to even 20%, or 203 grams per kilogram in the diverse mixture. Now let's have a look at the methane and milk yields. So on this graph here, you can see the results for the binary and the diverse mixture for the early lactation, so 50 days in milk, and the late lactation, 150 days in milk. And in blue, you can see the milk yield in ECM per cow and day. And in orange, you see the methane intensity, which means the methane emissions in gram per kilogram of ECM. And capital letters, differences in capital letters indicate significant differences. And what you can see is, first of all, that the milk yields were very high, particularly in the first period. We had around about 30 kilograms of ECM from our jerseys, which is really high for jerseys. And this was reduced later on to 22, 23. But still, in both periods, the diverse mixtures had slightly higher milk yields than the binary mixtures. It wasn't a lot, but around about a liter on average, more 1 kilogram ECM more on average in the diverse mixtures, and this difference was significant. But surprisingly for us, also the methane emissions were slightly higher in the diverse mixture compared to the binary mixture. And that was unexpected because, of course, as I mentioned, this one contains the tannin-containing species, so we expected methane emissions to go down. This wasn't the case, but as you will see in a second, still the methane emissions throughout were really, really low. And this was, in order to show you this a little bit better, we have done a comparison with all the different pasture-based studies that we found. So all of these studies that you can see here are pasture-based and have measured methane emissions on that pasture and milk yields. And let me say at first that between study comparisons, between different studies is always a bit difficult because, of course, all kinds of things change. So I could, of course, show you here that we had the lowest methane emissions from all these studies reported, etc. But this doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot because, as I said, methodologies might differ. So I want to pick out one particular comparison, which at least to me made things really more or easier to grasp basically. And if you look at the milk yield here in kilogram ECM per cow and day, you can see again the blue bar here are our jerseys at the Lindhof. And if you look at the comparison to Foulum in Denmark, where they tested both Holstein Friesians and jerseys, and if you look at those jerseys here, then these jerseys, they were both jerseys, our cows and their cows were both jerseys. They had the same body weight, around about 460 kilograms of body weight, both of our groups, which is important because that means that they have the same amount of forage intake basically, and they were in the same stage of lactation. So both of these bars are from around about 50 days of lactation. So this means it is highly comparable because it's the same species, same body weight, same stage of lactation. The difference is, however, that these jerseys in Denmark were fed 62% concentrates in the diet. So 2/3 of their diet were concentrates, whereas in our diet, it was more around about 10 to 15%. And despite the fact that they were fed 4 times more concentrates and having the same life weight and everything, the jerseys at the Lindhof still had slightly higher milk yields than those cows with their high concentrate forages. And to me, that shows 2 things. That the genetic material of our jerseys is quite excellent, but also that the high forage quality that they got from the pastures with up to more than 12 megajoule metabolizable energy can really produce really high milk yields. And because of these very high milk yields, then the very low methane emissions also make sense, because methane emissions are basically a waste product of an inefficient digestion. So if the digestion system is very, very efficient, then of course the methane emissions also go down, which also makes these semi-quantitative comparisons more believable. And whether this is going to be the lowest one really or not doesn't really matter, but the methane emissions are definitely really low from pasture-based systems and can be lower than from concentrate-based diets. But we didn't stop at looking at methane emissions, and I was told that the nitrous oxide emissions are also quite interesting to you. So we have also looked at the nitrous oxide emissions, and here I'm just showing you the comparison of grazed and ungrazed pastures. So we have again the binary, ternary, and diverse mixtures. And again, to our surprise, there was no real difference in nitrous oxide emissions across these 3 measurements. But what had, of course, a huge effect is whether the pastures were grazed, which of course resulted in additional nitrogen inputs. So we had urine and dung on these swards, whereas here the only nitrogen source was the nitrogen fixation from the legumes, as these swards generally aren't fertilized at all. So of course, with more nitrogen inputs, you also have higher nitrous oxide emissions. And again, the pastoral diversity didn't have an effect, which surprised us, because, for example, the ripwort plantain that is in the diverse mixtures had also before shown to reduce nitrous oxide emissions. But again, the pasture diversity gradient didn't have much an effect, but grazed generally had much higher emissions versus ungrazed. But this sounds worse than it is, because if you put it into perspective, we have also measured the nitrous oxide emission factor. And what the emission factor is you determine how much of the nitrogen that was applied to a system is emitted as nitrous oxide. So the fraction of the nitrogen that ends up as nitrous oxide. And again, we have tested that across our 3 mixtures. And we have applied a homogeneous amount of nitrogen from urine from our cows or from dung from our cows, and then have measured exactly how much of that nitrogen that we applied as either urine or dung at exactly that spot resulted in nitrous oxide emissions. And the average emission factor that you can see here as the dotted line was around 0.18%. So less than 0.2% of the nitrogen that was applied to these pastures as urine or dung ended up as nitrous oxide. And that was quite surprising, particularly for the urine, because urine spots are really rich in nitrogen, and usually this is quite volatile. But under those given environmental conditions, these swards were able to take up really by far most of that nitrogen. And these emission factors are really much lower, actually only a quarter of what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is estimating as emission factors for temperate grassland systems. So we have generally already seen that both nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions are really low from these systems, independent actually of the diversity gradient. And finally, I also want to talk briefly about the nitrate leaching potential, which is of course another environmental issue. And here in this study, we have compared the nitrate leaching of different production systems. So we have the permanent grassland here on the left, either fertilized with 240 kilograms of nitrogen as slurry or without any fertilization. And then we have two age levels basically of our grassland mixtures. And here, here I'm presenting the average of all three mixtures. So this is the average of all three diversity gradients, but presented for 3 different years. And so this is the establishment year of the mixtures, and this is the first year. And these systems here are cut for silage cuts. And then we have grazed swards here, which are either in the first full production year or in the second full production year. And if you look at the permanent grassland, you can see that interestingly, even supplying 240 kilograms of N as slurry did not increase nitrate leaching, and nitrate leaching amounts stayed below 5 kilograms of nitrate N per hectare. And in silage cut systems, also nitrate leaching was generally very low. Grazed systems naturally had higher leaching amounts compared to the silage cut systems. The reason is the same as for the nitrous oxide emissions, that you have additional nitrogen inputs from urine and dung. And because this is an accumulative effect, the second year had higher emissions than the first year, actually quite substantially higher, but this was very much year dependent. So in 2018-19, we had a very dry year, and as a result of that, there was almost no leachate at all. But if you have a wet year, such as 2017-18, then the 2-year-old grazed swards showed quite high nitrate leaching amounts, but at less than 30 kilograms nitrate N per hectare, this is still far below the threshold, the legal threshold of 50 kilogram N per hectare. So still fine, but the highest nitrate leaching losses from these treatments, and this is for 2 reasons. A, as I said, there's an accumulation of urine and dung N in the swards, and in the second year, the legumes and particularly the red clover start to increase their root turnover rates and free up nitrogen from the rhizobia in the soil as well. But generally, we have seen that in these pasture systems where you have very short grazing intervals, you have an excellent forage quality. And this is even true for the diverse mixtures where this is quite a lot more difficult to maintain this perfect forage quality. But still, we have seen that both of these mixtures, all of these mixtures enable really high milk yields and low methane emissions. And in these dense grassland swards, also nitrous oxide emissions and the nitrate leaching are really only minor if the swards don't become too old, particularly if they're grazed. Contrary to our expectations, the tannate-containing species, so the diverse mixtures, did not really reduce methane emissions. The reason for that is quite simple, though, because at this use intensity that we have with 9 to 11 grazing cycles per year, these species are outcompeted quite quickly. So a lot of these tannate-containing species are quite extensive. They can be grazed 3 to 4 times maybe, but not grazing them 9 to 11 times was just too much, and they were simply outcompeted. And as a result of that, of course, they can't reduce methane emissions if they're really not in the pasture. So they might be a solution for more extensive systems, but in these intensive grazing cycles, they are not as promising as they are right now. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And yes.
Thanks, Carsten. That was great. If you want to just stop sharing your screen, that would be fab.
Yes, there we go.
Perfect. Thank you. So we've got a couple of questions, which we'll just go to before we move to Hannah. One question just asking about the methane emission, how were they measured? Can you just explain the system for the measurement, please?
Of course. Actually, I would have had a slide on it, but anyway, I'm just trying to explain it right now. But basically, what you use is we have this capsule, which is filled with sulfur hexafluoride, which is called SF6 abbreviated. And the benefit of this SF6 is that it is completely respired from the animal. So it doesn't stay within the animal at all. And you take this capsule and you insert it into the animal, and then you have a constant permeation rate, meaning that there is a constant flow rate of SF6, which we know because it's calibrated. And with that, we know how much SF6 is leaving the animal at any given time, and because it's completely respired immediately. And then we have two bottles which are attached to the animal via a belt. And these bottles have a vacuum in them. And from that, those bottles, you have a tube going up to the mouth of the animal, where you have two inflow restrictors. And these two inflow restrictors restrict the inflow from the mouth at very, very small rates. So you have less than 1 milliliter of air being sucked away from the mouth and into those bottles. And at the end of the measurement period, you take away those bottles and you take samples from them. And then you determine how much methane is in those bottles and how much SF6 is in those bottles. And because you know exactly how much SF6 was permeated from those tubes in that time frame, you can calculate the fraction of that SF6 that you caught in your bottles. And with that, you can then calculate how much of the methane you also caught from the methane that was respired. And with that, you can then determine the amount of methane that was emitted. It sounds more complicated than it is, but the advantage is that this is the only method that you can use in the field with grazing pastures, or the best method at least, because it doesn't involve respiration chambers or any other complicated high-tech things.
That's brilliant, thank you. And I guess then if this is the only method, then anybody who's undertaking these sorts of studies, you've got quite standard comparisons that you can make?
Generally, yes. There are some other techniques, but they don't measure constantly, usually, with the exception of eddy covariance. But this would go too much into detail. Yes, generally it is very comparable, and most people use SF6 for these studies.
Okay, and then just on the methane question, we've got somebody's asked, with the dairy cows, how much of an opportunity is there to offer methane inhibiting materials in that small amount of concentrate that they do get daily?
It is actually for these, as we saw that actually in those pastures, the tannin-containing herbs don't really persist. This is probably the best option that we have indeed. And we are doing experiments right now as well, trying to see how we can mix the concentrate with purified tannins. And this might indeed be the best way for these kind of swards. For extensive mixtures, you are able to use the tannin-containing species, which are grazed in, but indeed for these intensities and for in-barn systems as well, mixing them into the concentrate is probably the best way to go.
And just final question on the tannin-containing species, and there's a question about how much is needed in the seed mix, either as a percentage or kilos, to contribute enough tannins to have an effect on methane, but maybe you weren't able to work that out because of the issue with persistence. Yeah,
it is a very difficult question because it really depends on your conditions. We generally use quite little, and we had, for example, 2018, 2019 was a very the year beforehand was very dry, 2018, and in the very dry year, those tannin-containing species performed much better because the grass was much weaker, and as a result of that, also less competitive. And then those species were performing much better, but then in our sampling year, it was sort of optimal conditions, and then the grass outcompeted everything. So it really depends. Under more detrimental conditions for the grasses, they would have maybe performed better. But yeah, generally, so the share very much varies, but yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. There are some more questions, but we'll come back to those after we've heard from Hannah. So don't disappear anywhere, hang around, and yeah, we'll get those questions in a second. So Hannah, over to you.
Cool, thank you. Okay, you can see my screen. Yes.
Yeah.
So hi, thank you everybody. I'm Hannah from Newcastle University, and I'm going to be talking to you today about production efficiency in low input and pasture-based dairy herds. So to farm sustainably, to start with, we'll talk about why dairy cow efficiency is important. So to farm sustainably, economic efficiency is essential. But when we go beyond economic efficiency and we start thinking about environmental sustainability, then physiological efficiency is also important. So an efficient dairy farm helps to minimize costs and reduce environmental impact by breeding cows that eat less but produce the same yields, or eat the same and produce more milk. So performance in conventionally managed Holstein Friesian cattle is predominantly defined by the highest yielding. But these farms and cows, they typically have high energy requirements, poor fertility, and poor health traits. Whereas performance and priorities in low input and or pasture-based farming is a combination of the farm or the cow's yield, health, and fertility. And because these cows mostly are not solely pushed for their output, that means that the milk yields are inevitably lower than some of these intensive dairy systems. But cows selected for performance in predominantly forage diets tend to have better health, better fertility, they're better at converting forage into milk. And as we talked about last time, if any of you are here for the previous webinar, it typically produces milk that has a more beneficial fatty acid profile for human health. So this kind of demonstrates that alternative metrics here are required when we discuss dairy cow efficiency. So really the challenge here is that the research has focused so much on Holstein Friesians, but UK interest in grazing-based dairying is rising, but there's little guidance on the breeding priorities. So that means that individual farms customize their crossbreeding to suit their system. And because most scientific research has focused on Holstein Friesians, there's very little recognized research into breeding for crossbred cattle in smaller, low input and organic dairy systems. Yet these farms, as we just said, have progressed with crossbreeding for many generations within their herds. So they use a different strategy to search for breed combinations that perform within their systems. So there's not a clear breed or crossbreed that typically outperforms others in low input or pasture-based systems in the same way that Holstein Friesians dominate conventional production. Additionally, because of how developments of breeding within low input systems have occurred, it makes it really quite difficult to study, as I will show you soon. Additionally, many pasture-based farmers aim to utilize the grazed grass, so therefore they spring block calve. So as you see here on the right, the AHDB has a spring calving index, and this is aimed at herds that will make the best use of grazed grass. And because of that, they assign 71.6% of the weighting to fitness traits. So you can see here, down here in spring block calving, you want high fertility, so there's 24.8% assigned to fertility. But the predominant driver is still milk production. So that's this one up here at 27.4. Additionally, looking at this, the definition of efficiency is slightly lacking. So this is defined as efficiency, refers to decreasing the live weight. So that supposedly means improved efficiently suited to spring calving in a grazing-based system. So again, this isn't talking about efficiency in converting forage or grass into milk. So what did we do? Within the SusCatt project, we had two main, well, in the Newcastle University aspect of SusCatt, we had two main studies that we did. So the main aim for this first one was to coordinate information from innovative farmers that were looking for common themes, which might cut short the process for future farmers. So we had 17 herds, 7 were organic and 10 were low input conventional. And all farms had a mix of both purebred and crossbred cows, with the pedigree of each cow described by the farmers. Production, fertility, and health records from just over 1,000 cows were collected 4 times over a year. There was also individual milk samples taken, which were able to assess the fatty acid profile, as well as basic composition, including fat, protein, and somatic cell counts. So in total, we collected information on 40 different breeds and crosses. And as I talked about earlier, some of them were in such small numbers. Occasionally there was just one on any single farm. So as I said, that might just be where farmers are being innovative and trying to work out the best breeds that suit their systems. So to generate guidance relevant for a range of systems, we restricted the comparison to records with at least 6 cows of the same breed or combination of breeds on at least 3 different farms. So that meant that we were able to bring the number of breeds down from 40 to 8, which was much more manageable. All of the individual assessments, as you see in here, were then combined to give 2 overarching scores. So the scores had different weightings to allow breed ranking under 2 different priorities. So we made a health score, which was given 30% production, and we defined production as their milk yield and the total fat and protein solids. 50% to health, and health was typically the udder health, so the somatic cell count, and any treatments, including antibiotics or others such as pain or anti-inflammatory, and the fatty acids. And as we talked about last time, we talked about the percentage of the total fatty acid profile, and I split that up into desirable fatty acids. So that was typically the omega-3s, and more undesirable fatty acids, as such the omega-6 and some of the saturated fatty acids. So what did we find? So this is a shorthand. I've combined the scores based on the ranking systems. So some of these changed a little bit, but in both the health and the production score, the New Zealand Friesian cross outperformed all other breeds. So that's in terms of the milk quality, in terms of the productivity, and in terms of the health. And in both of those scenarios, also the dairy shorthorn performed the worst. But in each of these situations, or in for each of these breeds, they all had a strength, or at least one strength, and they all had a weakness. So again, this is kind of demonstrating the lengths that farmers have gone to develop the breeds and the crossbreeds within their systems to find what is going to best fit. So maybe if you found that you had a high use of antibiotics in your system, maybe it would be beneficial to cross with some dairy shorthorns, and hopefully that would bring down some of the treatments. It's also important for us to note here that I'm not saying that these would be, this New Zealand Friesian cross or this Ayrshire cross would be the best for any low input or pasture-based system. In this study, we weren't able to look at forage conversion because we didn't know the consumption of each of the cows in each of the farms. Additionally, our dairy shorthorns and the Ayrshires are especially well known for their temperament, and that was not taken into consideration in the study. And unfortunately, extracting the fertility information was near on impossible. So that was also not included in this. So that would definitely alter some of these rankings. But based on the scores that we did give, New Zealand Friesians performed the best, and dairy shorthorns were outperformed by every other breed. I do think it's also important to note here that our Holstein Friesians performed pretty poorly as well. So despite having a good milk yield, the fat composition and their treatments was very high. So we'll move on to our next study. So this was the one that we did more recently. So we aimed to investigate a combination of milk quality and individual cow performances, trying to identify key factors that influence production efficiency in pasture-based dairying. So in this pasture-based dairying, this management system, as you guys all well know, aims to rear cattle that are well adapted to these low input systems. So that happens by selecting breeds and family lines that stay healthy and efficiently convert forage to milk without reliance on antibiotic, fertility treatments, or other inputs. So this study required 3 commercial farms that were willing to participate in research from calving to drying off, which was about February to November. And to qualify for this study, all the farms had to be spring calving. The farmers were then asked to select a range of cattle within the age range to reflect the diversity of breed, size, and productivity. The cows wore roomy watch halters, which you can see here in these pictures. This is actually a Pasture-Fed Livestock farm down here. They wore halters for 2 weeks at 3 key periods during 2018. So that was early, mid, and late lactation. And the halters recorded eating and ruminating behavior, which meant that we could then model dry matter intake. And by calculating dry or estimating dry matter intake, we could calculate efficiency. Initially, we had aimed to incorporate health and fertility into this trial to get a sort of wider gauge and metric of efficiency within these pasture-based systems. But on 2 of the farms, there were absolutely no incidences of any illness, including mastitis. And all farms calved within 10 weeks. So fertility in all cases really was exceptionally good. But we did still find some interesting results. So what we did here was look at if low input farmers were able to select efficient cows and how they might go about doing that. So first off, we wanted to know, are efficient cows consistent? Is that something that's consistent throughout lactation? And how can we look at that? So here we have A, B, and C. So these are the 3 different farms. And the higher the estimated dry matter intake per energy corrected milk yield produced, the higher that is, the least efficient those cows were. And down here we have the most efficient cows. Basically, if they eat less but produce more milk, the score is lower. So that would then indicate an increased feed conversion efficiency. So this research found that there are cows from each farm that are consistently efficient or inefficient throughout lactation. But it also found cows whose production efficiency changes throughout lactation. So this does suggest that there is some scope for pasture-based farmers to select efficient cows in their systems in early lactation before bulling. That would then be able to decide which cows to inseminate for replacements if efficiency is their desired outcome. So you can see here this cow 656 in farm C, she was the most efficient cow, and she was the most efficient cow at the 3 stages of lactation, all 3 stages of lactation that we measured. So she might be a good one to look at for future breeding. But how are we able to identify these cows? So we assigned an efficiency group, 1 to 5. So 1 is the most efficient group here, and 5 is the least efficient group. So I took the data from all of the cows from all of the farms and pulled it sort of separately but together. So there's a representative number of cows from each farm in group 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Hopefully that makes sense, but let me know if it doesn't. So what we found is that the most efficient cows, I guess by definition of efficiency, produce the most energy corrected milk yield per kilogram of dry matter consumed. In addition, these cows spend the least time eating, the least time ruminating, and they also regurgitated fewer boluses and chewed less per bolus than any of the other efficiency groups. This also supports earlier studies that suggested that efficient cattle are also efficient with their eating and rumination behaviors. One of the other things that was interesting is that the most efficient cows also had the highest fat percentage. And whilst we were using energy corrected milk, so we were adjusting for fat and protein anyway, this was not true for protein. It was just true for fat. And you can see it was quite a lot higher in group 1 compared to group 5. So that indicates that there is potential for farmers to identify efficient cattle potentially by their fat content, but definitely further research would be needed to confirm that. So to conclude, or what we found out is, what we know is, the more forage that cows eat, the better the milk quality for human health, and more well-utilized forage in the dairy diets lowers the environmental impact. So, and also how different grazing strategies impact soil and forage quality. But we still are not quite sure as to how select the cows that are best suited to forage-based systems without going through sort of the AHDB or the intensive like bull and calving index routes, by sort of using farmers' own intuition and then using that to develop future breeding programs. We also don't know which grazing strategy or types combinations of forage are best for milk quality and the environment. And I would also tag on to that how we can improve or maintain animal health and fertility. So we need evidence for farming systems that support the environment and provide nutritious food. So I'm sorry if I rattled through that a bit quick. Feel free to ask some questions. So yeah, thank you to our funders, and thank you for listening and inviting me along to talk today. And I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Hannah. That was great to hear, and I think particularly for those folk who were at the last session where you were talking about the different breeds, it will be interesting to have kind of linked those together. So thanks for that. We've got a question around efficiency being related to rumen microbiome, and is that a possible method for selection? Are you aware of any research going on in that area?
We actually have a PhD student at the moment who is doing some work on the microbiome of the rumen. I do not know a ton about rumen microbiome, but it wouldn't surprise me. Sort of the better the bacteria in the rumen, or the more efficient they are at converting their forage or their feed into milk, and less methane and less output, then that will definitely improve efficiency. So that would make sense.
Excellent. So maybe we could invite your PhD student to come along at some point in the future, and they can tell us what they found out. Another question for you: how is intake derived from grazing / ruminating behavior?
Good question. A really complex model that we used, I can pull it up, but it was a paper that was submitted by another researcher who compared a lot of different models as to how to calculate dry matter intake based on ruminating and eating behavior, but also time spent ruminating and eating, as well as the number of chews, as well as their production, their age, their weight, and there was another thing as well. But yeah, it didn't take into consideration sort of the forage quality, which would maybe be a limitation of that. But of all the models, it was supposedly the best model to use for predicting dry matter intake, especially in forage, as many of the models that are used to predict intake are based on inside systems and are based on high concentrate or total mixed rations, which just aren't representative of grazing intake.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, we're going to go back to some questions that came in earlier on in the session. I think there's one from Dave Stanley, which I think Havard wants to answer. And the question is, has consideration been given to assessing environment impacts using GWP star and gross fossil fuel input? Yes,
thank you for this question. Yeah, we have done that as well, and I didn't give that presentation, but we are not finished with it, because my colleague that helped me with this life cycle assessment, where we calculate these indicators, has struggled to give, but we plan to include that as well. We haven't published this in a scientific journal yet, but that is our plan, and then we definitely want to include a GWP star as well into that. And gross fossil fuel input is also included here. That is included in the calculation we did as a part of the so-called energy intensity indicator that I presented.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, another question. This one's for Carsten, I think. We are usually told that methane emissions are higher on a forage-based diet because of the high fibre content, but your results appear to contradict that conclusion.
Yes, that's true. And I'd say that this is because our forage was really, because of the high grazing intensity of 9 to 11 grazing cycles, the fibers, we usually graze at around 1.2 tons of dry matter per hectare equivalent, basically. So the material is quite short and very young, and there is very little stemmy material, and it's almost entirely leaves. And as a result of that, the fiber isn't as large as you would expect. So the larger the forage gets and the more stemmy material you have, the more this will become true, that methane emissions will increase, probably. But with this very young and leafy material, this apparently isn't yet the case.
Excellent, thank you. And I think another question for you that you've identified you want to answer is around the cow's digestive system takes time to adjust to different feed. Do you think this might have influenced the results, maybe delayed methane reduction from more diverse pasture? It
is an excellent question, yes. And what I didn't mention is that before the cows were separated into the groups for the experiment, they have already, from the beginning of their lactation period, grazed both pastures. So they were on both pastures all the time. So their rumen was pre-adapted to both the binary and the diverse mixture. And then for the experimental period, they were split up. There was a short adaptation period of only 4 days. But because their rumen fauna was pre-adapted, that was then sufficient to adjust. And actually, it is more of a concern. I mean, even if we had more tannin-containing forages, it would be more of a concern that the effect will be limited in time and that the rumen will adapt at some point and methane emissions will increase again despite the tannins. But for this experiment, that wasn't a factor.
Excellent. That's all the questions that we've had through the Q&A box, but I've just had a quick look in the chat and there's a couple of comments there. And there was a question about grazing approaches with extending rest periods to allow more of the taniferous herbs to persist. And I think, Carsten, you've identified that you thought that would be interesting research to consider the grazing strategy as well as the sward mix.
Yes, exactly. And by the way, I also answered some questions in text, which are now under the sort of responded file, because there were some that were quite easy to answer in text.
Brilliant, that's great, thanks. Yeah, so if you feel like your question hasn't been answered live, you can go to the Q&As and click on answered, and hopefully you'll see that your question has been answered there. I don't think we've got any other open questions other than we want Havard to come back to present the additional results when you have them. So we'll get you back to do that at some point in the future. Just before we finish up, I'm always interested to know what researchers are working on next. So it'd be really nice to hear just very briefly from each of you what you're currently working on, and if there's anything that you're soon to be possibly publishing. Havard, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. Currently, I'm involved in a couple of projects where we look at the forage quality and the silage quality, how that affects both the methane emission from the rumen, but also we are focusing on, because there's a very high focus on the protein value, or that try to avoid to use soy. That's the point. And my point is that you are underestimating the protein value of the forage, particularly in the silage. The way we preserve the silage, we can improve the protein value of the silage very much. We have to remember that the forage is the main protein source for cattle. And for dairy cow, the way we preserve the silage by, for instance, wilt the silage, so that we keep the water-soluble carbohydrates, the sugar in the grass, in the silage, that may have a strong impact on the protein value. In fact, the sugar is more limiting than the protein for the protein value. So I would like to come back to present that for you in a year's time. And I think that we will have we will both do some silage experiments, but laboratory silage, but we're also doing some feeding experiment with dairy cows, both looking at the restricted fermentation by increasing the dry matter before we make the silage, but also using some restricting additives that restrict the fermentation.
Oh, that's brilliant. I think we'll definitely have you back to talk about that in a year's time. I'm sure there's lots of folk who'd be interested to hear more. Carsten, what are you working on at the moment?
Two things, basically. The one thing is that we are looking at also how the grassland ley is also providing benefits for a follow-on crop and a crop rotation. So we are doing lots of trials where we are trying to see how these grass legume mixtures can also benefit a follow-on crop with establishment and yield due to more nutrient transfers, etc., and stuff like that, so that we have the entire crop rotation. And the other thing, because we saw that is exactly what was mentioned before, that we are trying to see how tannins can also be introduced into diets as extracts so that they can be mixed with the concentrate, and how these could be then benefit our systems a bit more.
Brilliant, Carsten. And if you manage to investigate maybe silver pasture as an option for that and looking at tree forage for tannins, then I'm sure there's lots of folk in the PFLA who'd be supportive of that research. Okay. Hannah, we've got about 30 seconds or so before we finish. What are you working on at the moment?
Thanks. I've got a couple of things going on at the moment. We've got a mob grazing trial that is just established. So Newcastle University, one of the university farms, Cockle Park, has some growers out on their sort of longhorn crosses, and they are split into 2 mob groups and 2 rotational groups. And then also within that design, it's split into a grass clover ley and a mixed diverse ley. So we'll be looking at the differences between there. We've got a grazing trial or a grass trial going on, looking at 5 different species mixes in a sort of 8x5 design. And we'll be looking at establishment and survival of them. We've got a plot that's looking at different covers, so optimizing cover when the cattle go in versus when they come out, and what makes the most sense in terms of utilization. We're just establishing a grazing hub and an arable. And you made me rush, and now I'm muddling my words. We have a grazing hub and an arable hub that we are setting up. So if anybody is interested in taking part in that or being on a mailing list, feel free to email me. And there was one other thing that I was thinking of. Oh, and we're developing an agroforestry platform as well, which will incorporate the livestock. So loads going on. Feel free to get in contact.
Brilliant, Hannah. Thank you so much. Thank you again to all 3 of you for your time this evening. Really appreciate it. It's been super interesting to hear what you've been talking about. We are just over time, so we'll wrap up there. But thanks again, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Nikki, for hosting. And
thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.